Let me know when you.
certification.
All right, we're good to go. We're recording. Okay. Welcome, everybody. As Mary said, I'm Mike Geringer, the Senior Director of Research and Quality at Mentor's National Office. It's good to be with all of you today. I'm joining you from Portland, Oregon, which is where I live, but I am a son of the Hawkeye State. Most of my family, in fact, pretty much all my family lives along the interstate in tiny little towns like Victor and Brooklyn and the Amana colonies and places like that. So if that's familiar territory for any of you, that's where my peeps are at. But it's good to be with you. And I only bring that up because today we are talking about some recent research on what youth in rural communities are experiencing around mentoring. So just a quick sneak preview of what we're going to be covering today. I mostly am going to be sharing some results with you from a study that Mentor did last year called the Who Mentored You study. We actually came out with this in January back at the National Mentoring Summit, but we're still pulling all kinds of good information about out of this data set. In fact, I did some analysis around rural youth in particular and what they said here for this conversation. So you will be getting some information that no one in America has seen yet about this study. I'm also going to briefly talk about a research synthesis that we did on our federal National Mentoring Resource Center project that looked at the research and kind of what we know about several dimensions of mentoring youth in rural communities. But really, then we're going to spend hopefully a good chunk of time on numbers 3 and 4 here, which is really talking about kind of what are the implications of this research for your work and kind of strengthening and expanding mentoring in rural places. And then obviously I want to have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. So if it's all right with you, Mary, I'm just going to dive in.
Sounds great.
So, and Mary did tell me I've got more slides than I can possibly cover in our allotted time. So, as usual, she's correct about that, but I'll do my best. I am going to be sharing a copy of these slides with everybody here. So, if I go through things a little fast or we don't spend much time on a slide or two, in the interest of time, don't worry, you'll be able to look at these in more detail when we're done here. But there was quite a bit I wanted to kind of share with you that I thought would be of interest to you all. And I think we're going to start with some data from that Who Mentored You study around who gets mentoring relationships, both writ large in this country and especially then in the rural areas that we're focused on today. So just very quickly for folks who didn't see that report when it came out back in January and haven't kind of seen this in the months since. The Who Mentored You study was really a retrospective look at the mentoring experiences of all American adults. So we did a big national survey with adults ages 18 to 80 and above. I think our oldest respondent was like 84 or something like that. And much like a political poll that you may see around an election or something, this was weighted to be truly representative of the U.S. population. So we feel very confident that these findings are really what you would get if you asked thousands and thousands of people these questions over and over again. It would look like this. So we, estimated, I don't have it on the slide here, the margin of error was only about 2% for this study. So pretty close to what we, I don't have it on the slide. It should have been on here, but yeah, it was about 2.5% margin of error. So, these are not absolutely perfect numbers, but usually when you do these, you're looking for a margin of error around that amount. So a couple of things definitionally here that will be helpful moving forward. We wanted to take a look at how mentoring in America has changed over many generations. So going back to the baby boomers of my parents' generation, my own Gen X people, and then millennials. And then kind of the youngest cohort we looked at was kind of Gen Z. which in our sample here was young people that are 18 to about 24 years of age when they filled this out. You'll notice that we talked to a lot more of those young people here. About half of our sample was Gen Z. A couple of reasons: we were comparing what we found here to an older study that Mentor had done, so we kind of needed about 1,200 of those young people. But also, these are the young people that just got done being in mentoring programs when they were in elementary, middle, high school, right? And so we thought that they would have kind of the most accurate perceptions of what mentoring is like for today's young people, the folks that may be younger than 18. And we found some very interesting trends that we'll talk about. I'm also going to talk about some regional things. There's a couple of slides that look at how mentoring is different from region to region. I included the two kind of groupings here, and we did not, these are like census groupings from the federal government. So if you're frustrated that your state is lumped in with other ones here, that was not our decision. It was how the federal government views it. But you can see the breakdowns of who's in kind of the range of states I think I'm speaking to here today, which is really kind of an eastern side of the Midwest and kind of a western and a little more northern side of the Midwest as well. Although not perfect breakdowns. We could probably argue forever about who belongs in what group. I used to rely on college football conferences to figure out where places were, but my Oregon Ducks are joining the Big Ten next year. So who knows? That regional thing has kind of died in the world of college football. So the first thing I'm going to talk about here is kind of at a macro level of who in this country is getting mentoring across the generations. And what I want to draw your attention to here is, if we start on kind of the right-hand side of the screen, less than half of baby boomers in that red bar there said that they had a mentor growing up. They may have had a meaningful person. We put some definitions on what we meant by a mentor, but certainly things like parents did not qualify there. Immediate family was kind of not counted as mentors. And you can see like only 9% of them said that they had a mentor through a program. That's the yellow bars here. Much more prominent were natural mentors. And as you can see, as we move from right to left, each generation kind of got more mentoring up to the millennials. Almost 70% of millennials said I had a mentor growing up. You'll also notice, though, there's a decline. So starting about 10 years ago, we started to see young people reporting less and less that I've got a mentor, right? It's still above where like my parents were 50 years ago, but it's declining for a number of reasons that we can talk about a little bit later. So all that to say is we have grown mentoring in this country over time considerably over the last 30 years or so, but we're starting to see a worrying trend that this is declining a little bit. So we looked at a whole bunch of demographic factors as to like which groups of people are getting more or less mentoring. So for example, on the left, you might be surprised to learn that LGBTQ plus people are more likely to say they had a mentor growing up than folks that do not identify that way. I'll direct you, though, to the right-hand side of the screen here where you see where you grew up, childhood, place of residence. And you'll see there that overall, rural folks are as likely as folks in suburban and urban environments to have had a mentor, less likely to get a programmatic mentor, though. And you can see by the little down arrow there that that's a statistically significant difference. So they are statistically significantly more likely to not have a mentor than their urban counterparts. I think it's helpful, though, to break this down to Gen Z. Once again, these are like 18 to 24-year-olds, kids who just got done, kind of with the typical ages where your mentoring programs might be serving them. And if you look here, you'll see, once again, a similar gap. So for this current generation, it's really suburban young people that get the most mentoring. Once again, 60% of rural youth say they've had a mentor or currently have one, which is a good number, but once again, the kind of scarcity of programmatic mentoring. They're much more likely to have had a mentor that's an aunt, an uncle, a pastor, a coach, a teacher, somebody like that. And we'll look at that breakdown here in a little bit. I should also add, Mary, I should have mentioned this before I started. I'm fine being interrupted with questions. So if folks want to ask me anything about any of these stats, I'm happy to answer any questions. So if we look at those regions that I mentioned earlier, you will see that on a whole, and this is for everybody, so including everyone from baby boomers to younger people today, the Midwest looks pretty good. That East, North Central and West, North Central categories there. A little bit lower on the programmatic side for the East, but, in general, not many differences here between what young people in those states are experiencing versus the rest of the country. It looks a little bit different if you filter that down to just Gen Z. You'll notice that the percentage of Gen Z kids saying, I had a mentor through the program has gone up considerably in those eastern states. So Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. We can see some signs that programmatic mentoring has really grown in those places. That rate of mentoring overall is pretty in line with the rest of the country. Out here in the Pacific, kids are less likely to have natural mentors. I don't know quite what explains that, but that is a significantly lower difference by region. So we also looked at some combinations of these demographics, and I'll just highlight the one that's kind of third in from the right here. We said for youth that are low income, so at or below the federal poverty line, and living in rural places, you can see kind of how this declines for them in comparison to other groups, right? So less than half of young people in rural places that are low income, growing up in a low income household, have a mentor, and only 11% of them are reached by a mentoring program. I will say that there's a general trend in our field that mentoring tends to be delivered more and experienced more by young people who are better well off in their homes socioeconomically. Parents can buy a lot of access to programs and sign them up for sports and get tutors and all kinds of other caring adults that get facilitated through those connections. So we see a real gap here for low-income youth in rural spaces. Was there a question that popped in? No? Okay, thought I heard a question. So that kind of tells you who's getting mentoring and how much they're getting. But we also wanted to look at kind of who wanted mentoring when they were growing up and didn't have it. To me, the biggest gap that we need to fill in our field is kind of who wants a mentor and isn't getting it, right? Because you could be doing fine and not feel like you need the help of a mentor. But what I'm concerned about is who's out there yearning for these types of relationships and not finding them. And we did find some interesting things about rural youth in that as well. So overall, I can tell you that approaching 70% of today's young people said there was a time growing up when I needed a mentor but didn't have one. The graphic here shows you kind of everyone, so all ages. If you look in the lower right corner, you'll see where you grew up, childhood location of residence. You'll see that rural folks are less likely to say that there was a time when they wanted a mentor and didn't have one when they were growing up, which I think is at some level good news, especially you'll notice in the blue bar there that is ages 16 to 18. So kind of that, high school and transitioning out of high school. Rural youth are actually significantly less likely to say they were missing mentoring, which I think is heartening. I wanted to see, though, how that looked a little bit different for today's younger people, right? Is most of this, baby boomers saying, I didn't need anybody back then, or, what are today's kids telling us? And here, I think you can see a little bit of a different picture. Once again, rural folks from Gen Z are still way less likely to say that there was a time I wanted a mentor and didn't have one. Those suburban kids clearly are wanting and needing and not getting the mentoring that they might want. And it's pretty consistent across the board at the age ranges, right? So about 22%-ish of rural youth say, at all four ages we looked at, starting at age 6 up through age 21, were there times when I, wanted a mentor and didn't have one. So I would say that, kind of unmet demand for mentoring looks best in rural places compared to other parts of the country. So that may be good news, I think, for your folks. Looking at it regionally again, we see some real differences. So once again, this is everybody that we surveyed out of the 3,000 or so people. The Midwest really has the lowest rates, even statistically significantly lower rates of needing a mentor but not getting one than other parts of the country. Once again, my Pacific time zone looks pretty bad here in terms of meeting the needs of youth who need a mentor. When we break that down by Gen Z, though, and some of those special population combinations, here's where rural spaces maybe don't look so good. So if you look at low income and rural youth, so folks, kids growing up in rural settings, but also growing up in kind of low income homes, 70% of them said there was a time where I needed a mentor and didn't have one. And that you can see kind of across all the age ranges here. It doesn't look very good, right? So especially ages 12 to 15, the kind of prime middle school years and elementary years, you're significantly higher than some of these other groups. So I think, well, in general, I think rural young people are not missing mentoring as much as kids in other places. Those growing up in lower income homes, I think, are really feeling the absence of caring adults in a meaningful way. And that is a trend that I think holds true nationally at some level, but I think the rural factors really combine with that to make it meaningful. You might be wondering, like, why did these young people want a mentor? What was the thing they were struggling with? In general, I think rural youth look very similar to the rest of the nation. They were more likely to cite a specific problem, trouble, and issue they were having, and you can see kind of a sub breakdown of many of those here. Much more likely to want help with issues of substance misuse, which surprised me. Folks, you may be wondering what gender issues mean. That's mostly gender identity, recognizing that I might be, gay or trans and struggling with telling folks that, the coming out process, things of that nature. There are other categories where rural youth seemed far less likely to say, I need help with something. So you'll see in the general category of, I just needed some support and some guidance, quite a bit lower than the rest of the country, less likely to say things like I felt lost or I felt lonely, less likely to be wanting academic help here towards the bottom of this slide, but more likely in that general category. That was kind of the catch-all for people that couldn't name a specific reason. We had a lot of feedback from rural folks saying, like, I could have just used help with all of it. I had this general feeling that there was not enough support for me. It wasn't really about any one specific thing, but I could have just used more adults around me helping me out. And then we also asked, like, okay, so you didn't get mentoring, you wanted it, but it wasn't happening for you. What were some of the barriers to that you might recall? And once again, I'm just comparing here kind of rural youth of the current generation to youth in other types of communities, and you'll see there's some differences here. I think the good news is that rural youth tend to know what a mentor is. They're far less likely to say, I didn't understand the point of it or why I'd want one. So that's good. Unfortunately, the next row down is, and this won't be a surprise, there just weren't many programs available to me. And, if I wasn't getting my mentoring through natural connections, then it probably wasn't happening for me because there wasn't a plethora of programs that I could go find mentors through in my community. A little less likely than the rest of the nation to say kids their age look down on mentoring. So once again, this tells me that young people in rural places, don't have a stigma around having a mentor. I think one of the things we learned in this study overall is there's a rising trend among young people that, it's like, oh, you need a mentor. There must be something wrong with you, which is really not the message we want to be sending as a movement. Everyone needs mentoring, right? So and less likely to be on a wait list for a program. I think that's mostly a function of there not being a program there to be on a wait list, but it may also be a sign that your programs are able to match young people a little more quickly than some of the larger programs in big cities. So what do youth get out of mentoring? We asked a whole bunch of questions of like, okay, you either did or did not get mentoring, but for those of you that did, what did this do for you? How did it help you? How exactly did your mentor make a difference in your life? And this is where I think, once again, rural youth look both similar and in some places different than youth in other places in the country. Before we get into kind of what they said about their mentors, I just want to note who these mentors were. So on the top rows here, we've got where they connected with program mentors. And you will see in the teal bars here, school is a very prominent place, not surprisingly, where they connect with mentors. And this is not filtered to rural youth. This is our whole sample, but there really wasn't a whole lot of difference here for rural youth, to be honest. Places like after-school programs are prominent. Religious institutions are also a prominent source. You can see when kids get a little older, 19 to 21, that bright blue bar for virtual online mentoring relationships pops up a little bit. Obviously, we don't have many 6 to 11-year-olds engaging mentors via email, but that's probably for the best. And then the bottom row here is natural mentors. Some people don't like the term natural mentors, but what we're talking about here are caring adults that have in the lives of a young person who they just have kind of created a mentoring relationship between the two of them, right? And as you can see, teachers are an incredibly prominent source of that, as are extended family members. So a lot of folks saying, my auntie, my uncle, my cousin who is older, folks like that. But certainly coaches, counselors, neighbors. It's a wide variety of folks, right? And I think the message I would deliver here is that kids are going to find mentoring where they can find it, right? And sometimes when they can't find it from the adults in the community, they find meaningful relationships with peers. And sometimes they're not the peers you wish they were hanging out with, right? And so I think, one takeaway from this is that kids need all kinds of mentors. They will need someone through your programs, but they will also need people from these other groups to step in. And so I think thinking about the intersection between your programmatic work and this web of other adults that are probably doing mentoring with young people is a really important one to think about. We asked people, how much credit for your success in life do you give your mentors? We just asked them to put a percentage on that from 0% to 100% of the credit. And if you look on the right here, you'll see that rural youth were as likely as anyone else to give about half the credit for their success in life to their mentors. You will see some other breakdowns here by race and ethnicity, certainly unsurprising given the role of elders in Native American culture, that they give their mentors a lot of credit for what good has happened in life. Us white folks, a little less so. The rugged individual nature of some of our culture comes up there. We tend to give our mentors less of the credit for how we turned out in life. Youth reported a very strong sense of belonging, or a stronger sense of belonging, if they had a mentor. You can see this on the left side of the screen here, or the right side, I should say. Much more likely to say that they had a strong sense of belonging when they were a young person, if they had a mentor. The blue table here really shows kind of the ratings of perceived sense of belonging growing up, comparing rural and non-rural youth. Rural youth are more likely to say I didn't have much of a sense of belonging, unfortunately, but they're also less likely to, these breakdowns are somewhat meaningless, but I do think the general trend here was less likely to say they had a sense of belonging. So we also had some questions around what your mentor did, right? And we compared here programmatic mentors and natural mentors. And I think what we found was that on many of these categories, natural mentors kind of outperformed, if you will, programmatic mentors, but most of these were not statistically different. And in fact, if anything, I think this really highlights the fact that in a mentoring program, you're often just bringing two strangers together, whereas in these more natural relationships, these are relationships that existed kind of before mentoring probably started happening, right? So you get to know your coach or your pastor or your next door neighbor, and over time you find out that, like, oh, we're kind of doing a mentoring thing here, whereas a program is kind of artificially creating that at some level. But this shows that programmatic mentors really can help in a wide variety of areas. Look at all the places where young people said my program mentor was very helpful, or fairly helpful. I will say this: when folks had both a program provided mentor and one that they'd found naturally, they were equally likely to say that the program mentor was their most important one. We kind of said, who is your top number one mentor of your life, and they were much more equally likely to say it was a program versus a naturally found one. We asked, what did your mentor help you with? What was the thing that you were working on? There's a lot going on this slide, but I think I'll direct folks to that third row down, which is mental health challenges. Very few Gen Xers and baby boomers said, this is what I needed help with. Millennials were more likely to say it. Look at this jump for Gen Z. 60% of them said, I really needed help with my mental health. So I think it's important that we prepare mentors for that, right? Teaching them some mental health first aid things, how to respond to certain moments of crisis, or when a young person is struggling with their mental health, how to make referrals to services that are beyond what a mentor in your program can address. So I thought these spikes around that issue in particular was really helpful. You'll also see that struggling in school has gone up significantly across the generations. We also then asked, like, what was the best thing your mentor did for you, or what was kind of the most helpful thing? And you can see kind of the full list here, but I really like to focus on the top one, help me build a sense of belonging. If you remember from that previous slide, we actually had pretty good evidence that having a mentor in your life, was correlated with having a stronger sense of belonging. We could argue about what's the chicken or the egg here. Do I find mentors because I already have a community that I belong to, or do they help me find that community? It's probably a little of both. But I think building that sense of belonging, having fun together, working on some problems, but also helping me understand who I am. So I really encourage folks to think about the concepts of identity formation and creating belongingness in your mentoring work. It kind of doesn't matter what else a kid's got going on in their life. If they don't understand who they are and how they fit into this world, they're probably not going to be able to tackle that other stuff as well. So I thought that was important stuff to look at. I meant to talk about this slide earlier. I think it got out of order somehow, but we also found correlations between stronger mental health as adults and whether someone had a mentor or not. And it was a statistically significant difference. Now, same chicken egg problem applies here. Did they have mentors because they had pretty good mental health and that made it easier? Or did the mentors help with that? I think we had some evidence from that previous slide that mentors can be very helpful. We know this from other research that mentors can help with things like depression and feelings of anxiety. The last thing I'll just note here is rural youth were probably the most likely in our entire sample to say that both program and natural mentors were positive experiences for them. So virtually no rural youth in our sample said that my experience with my mentor was even neutral, right? Like no one said it was negative. And as you can see, 98% said it was positive, 92% said that of their program mentors. And this is perfectly in line with what we find in other communities as well. So I'm going to stop there. Are there any questions about that data? I've got a little bit more information to share, but I wanted to see if there are any burning questions about that. Okay. Last thing I'm going to cover here is, I mentioned this earlier, we did do this review of the research on mentoring youth in rural settings. The URL where you can find this is at the top there. That'll get you to the National Mentoring Resource Center website. And from there, you just go in, there's a section called Research Tools, and you can find these and other evidence reviews listed in there. These reviews really focus on 4 questions here, and I'm not going to belabor you with what the 4 are, but they're basically like, does mentoring work for these kids? If so, what characteristics about them or their mentors or the program seem to influence how effective it is? The third question is around how does mentoring help, meaning what's happening when I mentor a young person that leads to them doing better on whatever the goal is. And then the fourth question is really around, have we done this work well? Do we know that we can scale this work, sustain this work, in this case in rural communities? I will note that there is not much research out there in the world of mentoring specific to rural settings. Even some of the really good research that's been done around like 4-H centered programs or boys and girls clubs in rural spaces, those kids are often lumped in with kids from suburban or urban environments. Even there was a great study of 4-H mentoring in Utah, which has got plenty of rural youth in it, but also, you know, most of the kids were from Salt Lake City or Ogden or, you know, the bigger cities. So it's been very hard to find research specifically around mentoring these youth exclusively. That being said, here's quickly what we found, and then I'd like to open this up for just discussion. There's a lot of promising signs and a lot of evidence that mentoring can be helpful for youth in rural settings, particularly around things related to physical health, mental health, academics. Other things such as involvement with the juvenile justice system really we didn't find much. This review was done in part by Katie Edwards at the University of Nebraska, and Katie's work really emphasizes mentoring for sexual minority and gender minority youth and youth of color in rural spaces. And so through her work, we were able to emphasize that a little bit here and really found mentoring in rural communities are especially beneficial for these young people, really can help them overcome some of the challenges that they're facing that are not exclusive to rural communities, certainly, but I think can be perhaps intensified in smaller communities. There were also examples of programs that were pretty effective that included kind of peer mentoring models, things focused on STEM careers, programs focused on the needs of Black and Latinx youth in rural spaces. So all this to say is, yes, mentoring works for these young people. I know you know that already. You do this work every day. In terms of things that influenced the effectiveness of mentoring, there really wasn't a whole lot to hang our hat on here, unfortunately, but there were some hints that when matches had strong emotional and social support, when mentors had high rates of attendance, and so those of you in rural places know how hard it can be to just get matches together and overcome kind of geographic distance alone is a barrier there. And then matching around similar backgrounds, interests, even same, racial or ethnic backgrounds, seem to be things that might improve the effectiveness of mentoring for rural young people. Those also apply to many other kids too. How mentoring works, there seemed to be some strong evidence that for youth in rural spaces, relationships that are defined by authenticity, by empathy, by collaboration, but also giving that youth some autonomy. I think it's important that mentors always remember it's the young person's journey, not yours. Building social emotional skills, and once again, that sense of mattering, that sense of belonging. I have a place in this world, and I can go places in my future. That hopefulness for the future, I think, is a very important outcome for all mentoring programs. And then, as we discussed earlier, for youth who have kind of minoritized status, not feeling particularly welcome in communities, the presence of a mentor can really bolster those feelings of belonging and kind of pride in one's self. And then lastly, there was pretty good evidence that rural mentoring is a thing that we can scale, although there are challenges. I don't think I need to tell any of you that, but there are a lot of assets in rural communities, right? There is often a very strong sense of community cohesion and togetherness. There's abundant natural resources often that can be used for mentoring activities. And I think, increasingly the use of technology and bringing in mentors from outside those communities to supplement what the adults in that community can provide. We saw plenty of evidence of that. I wrote up a little section at the end with some implications for mentoring in rural spaces. I think I just mentioned most of them, and certainly there are challenges to delivering these services that you all know and experience every day. And if there were easy solutions to them, we would have solved them already. But I think I'll focus here on the last two bullets, which is overall, if I look at the research on mentoring rural youth, I think it's really helpful for young people that are feeling marginalized within those communities. So immigrant youth, youth of color, generally gay and lesbian and trans youth, youth that might not be feeling part of the fabric of that community as deeply as they could. And I think you all are positioned to be really powerful agents of changing that experience for them and kind of increasing their feelings of acceptance, belonging, and that I can go and achieve. I think you all as practitioners are really well positioned to be those agents of change, not just for the young people, but perhaps for the community more broadly. And last but not least, I also came across a brand new study today that if anyone's interested in this, I'll send it to Mary and then she can break copyright law and send it to the rest of you. But I thought this was a really interesting study done by Matt Hagler, who is actually one of Dr. Gene Rhodes' mentoring disciples. So Matt has studied under Gene for many years and is now producing a bunch of great research, both about mentoring and then other kind of caring adult roles in kids' lives. Came across this paper. I guess it's not new. It's from 2019, but I hadn't seen it. It was a mixed methods investigation of kind of informal helpers to young people in rural places mostly young people in those places who'd experienced some really negative stuff, whether that was abuse experiences or ostracization because of, being gay or trans or things like that. Immigrant families that may not have had a great experience. And you can see kind of the money quote here that summed it up: the presence of a non-familial and non-professional helper. So, not a psychiatrist or anything here, was associated with higher post-traumatic growth, meaning I bounced back from whatever negative thing had happened to me better. Increased generativity, which is a very fancy word for saying I feel supported by other generations around me, and feel like I can engage with other generations. And perceive social support, the feeling that I've got people that care about me and are in my corner. So, whoops, I think I just moved forward too fast. Oh, let's discuss. So I'm going to quit sharing my screen now, but I did want to throw a few questions to consider up there. If you've got questions about any of the research I've shared here, I also thought it might be good for us to maybe just spend some time talking about, either what are assets that you're finding are really valuable to delivering mentoring in rural places, whether that's partnerships with other entities or how to connect with the schools or how to do recruitment better, or what's a challenge that's your program has faced recently that you maybe have solved and can share that wisdom with others. So, Mary, I don't know if you've got anything to add there, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can just talk it out for a little bit in our remaining time. So thank you for sitting through that. I know that was a long and a lot of information.
No, Mike, and that's great. There's so much information there, and those slides are really dense, and I know folks will be really interested to see them and just dissect them a little bit further. Yeah, I really would like to open this up to discussion. And first of all, if you have any questions for Mike, but then really would like to hear, what are we doing? How are we building on the strength of our rural communities? And let's talk about challenges too. So any of those things. I know this is not a shy group of Iowa folks. I know that too. So don't be, unmute and questions for Mike or your assets or challenges that you're seeing.
I guess I'll just ask the group, did anything I shared surprise you? Were you expecting maybe more differences between what rural youth are experiencing with mentoring and the rest of the nation, or did this kind of seem to confirm what you already knew about your work? I see Ashley nodding yes. Yeah.
I think, Mike, the waitlist question was interesting to me. So, I'm a school-based program. We have rural and metro models, and obviously due to sheer numbers, metro schools have more students waiting, but I do feel like the same is true for our rural. Our wait lists are there regardless. And I think our biggest challenge is in small rural communities, the few do everything. They're in every club, they're on every committee, they serve on every board. And so our concern is capacity and burnout. And, in your experience, we have board members, for example, that have been there for 20 plus years. There are no term limits because we don't know if we'll have people to help that. So I think we just need additional guidance on how do we bring in new energy and new blood. And everybody's so busy. Any insight?
Well, I think there's a couple of paths that you could explore, and one of them I think is more challenging, in that is finding ways to bring additional adults to rural communities. And I have seen programs, one of the programs discussed in this review is a program for Native American youth in South Dakota, in which college students got on a bus and took a bus for like an hour and a half to go meet their mentees on the reservation a couple times a week. And it was part of a class that they were taking, for I think they were all psych students or something. But, those are kind of, if you need to physically get people there, I see people doing those types of things. I think the other option is online services. I really wish we had kept the money in the Build Back Better plan to provide high-speed internet to every corner of this country. I thought that would have been an absolute game changer. I don't know why certain people opposed that, but it got taken out of that funding. So someday there will be high-speed broadband everywhere. It's shocking that we don't have it yet, but that would also really facilitate it. I think you are right. There is this limited people power in a rural space, and those that are engaged and have resources to share are often overtapped, right? And so I think so that in terms of just getting different and more adults are the types of pathways I see people exploring. I think on the flip side of it, and I don't know if this will resonate as a doable thing for you all, but one of the things we're talking about a lot at Mentor Nationally is we really found here that these naturally found mentors really outnumber program provided ones 3-to-1, 4-to-1 in the lives of folks. So when you said, who was your top mentor, you may have had 6 mentors growing up. Who was mentor number 1? It was about 4-to-1. People would nominate someone outside of a program, right? And so that tells me that they're going to find it where they're engaging with these folks, and your program might be providing a very specific mentoring experience for a specific age and specific reasons and that kind of thing. But I think all of you could play a role in infusing what we sometimes call a mentoring mindset into other adults in the community. There's a resource that Mentor came out with a year or 2 ago called Becoming a Better Mentor. And it was really written for all the people out there that are mentoring a kid, but not doing it through one of your programs: teachers, coaches, faith leaders, next door neighbors. When my wife and I bought our house, I wound up having a mentoring relationship with the kid who lived next door. He was 12 at the time. He's now like 30 something. And we're still in touch, but it was never planned. No one ever trained me. I mean, it's probably a good thing I work in the field I work in. I knew a little bit, but I think having conversations with those folks that for whatever reason may not want to mentor through your program, teaching them some skills about how to be more mentor-like when they do interact. And that includes the pediatrician and the nurses at the hospital and everyone you can think of, the school bus drivers. In rural spaces, they're spending a lot of time with kids. It's a lot of roads to drive down to get everybody. And so there's always these little moments where mentoring can happen. And I think what we found is if you can build adults' confidence about being that kind of person to someone else, they're more likely to just do it naturally, but they're also maybe more likely to be like, you know what, I think I could do this thing in your program that asks a little bit more of me. We do know from another study I did, there are people out there that are like, I'm willing to mentor, I just don't want to do it through a structured program. If some kid in my life asked me, of course I'd do it, but I'm just not interested in that. And so that's okay. But I also think programs, you're the relationship people at some level, right? And I think to the degree that you have got time and energy for it, training everybody in town to be more mentor-like to our young people is probably time well served, and it would probably help on that recruitment side too. At least that's my hope. Any other thoughts around this?
I would love to hear what Lynn's going to pop up too. I would just really like to hear what you guys see as strengths too in your communities too, because I think about just, some of you have lived in those communities your whole lives, the connections, and I think that you really build on that. But Lynn, I think you were going to pop on and say something, so I'll let you go ahead with your thought.
Well, I was just wanting to comment about Mike's. Mike was talking about the training others to be mentor-like. Is there something that's already put together for us that we could use?
So that Becoming a Better Mentor resource that I mentioned, I believe there is a training that we are going to be making available on that. Mary, you may know better than me
Yes.
whether someone turned my book into a training or not.
Yeah, so they have
Yes, they
developed those
did.
modules, and that's what we're offering. We're offering the first one next week, and
Oh.
it is mentoring mindset. And mentoring mindset something we can offer too, but we can talk more about, like, we have really been targeting that to your current mentors too, the becoming better mindset too. So it's like thinking about how we can bring that to other folks in your community too, and we could work with specific programs across the state too, or specific geographic areas, or it's online, but so
Yeah.
we could talk about that too, how we could offer that to potential mentors too. But definitely the mentoring mindset, yeah, we have that training. That's the way. There's so much there too, but we can parse that down to different time frames. But we'd love to offer that to communities. I mean, that does make sense to come out. Like, we've talked about that all the time too, about building that in all of the adults in the community too. So we can talk more with anybody that's interested in how that might look for your community and for your program.
And I should
And
have
I was-
known that we had that
yeah.
training.
No, that's okay. But
Yes.
I plug for that. If you haven't, that's next Tuesday. We're trying at the noon time for mentors. So promote that to your mentors too, is in the last newsletter, that they can join us for one of the Becoming a Better Mentor modules. Tony's all over this, so she's got it all down.
It's really a great it's a great resource. I'm a huge fan of it. So Becoming a Better Mentor strategies for being there for young people. Mike, I can't speak enough about the resource. It's really
Thank you.
helpful. It goes all the way from understanding empathy to making room for play, where young people are not going to get into a relationship and want to talk to an adult right away. You're going to have to play cards or whatever it is to do. But I just wanted to mention, Mike, thanks so much for bringing this information. I think what resonated with me the most is that everybody wants to belong. Everybody wants to belong. So it doesn't matter. It does matter, their culture, their race, and all those things. But when we get to the core of what's the common ground is that everybody wants to belong. Everybody wants to be seen and needs the support of a person who cares about them. And then that's contagious. That's what I love, is that once somebody finds that sense of belonging, then it becomes contagious. So I appreciate everybody on the call and all the work that you do, because that is what you resonate when I talk to you. So yeah, it's just another indication that, we have people in our lives who want to belong and need that connection.
Yeah. And I would say one last thing on that point. It's important to understand exactly how a young person is not feeling that sense of belonging. Mary and I were talking about this earlier. I saw a paper presented at a conference this past summer where they looked at a bunch of Big Brothers Big Sisters data and tried to answer the question, was Big Brothers Big Sisters reducing the feelings of loneliness and isolation in mentees in the program? And they kind of were like, it doesn't seem like it is. But then when they dug a little deeper, they were like, well, the reason these kids, is like a school-based mentoring data, they're like, these kids are feeling ostracized from their peers. It's not that they need more adults. They probably have some adults that are helping them. It's when they're in the hallway at school, their peers are rejecting them. That's why they're lonely. And so when you give them an adult mentor, you're not really fixing that problem, right? They still have the rejection from their peers. And so I think in those cases, you might be better off creating some kind of group mentoring program that gets peers interacting with each other in different ways and breaks up those cliques in the school, or, at least gives them a chance to have some positive peer relations with a smaller group that gets them and understands them, right? And so I think tailoring our work to the specific things young people are saying they need. Sometimes an adult is what you need. Sometimes it's not. So
otherwise, I won't be off until 4 to 5.
Was there another question there?
We just have a couple minutes left, but we have Mike here from International. This is your chance. He knows anytime that we're on a call, Mary always brings up something rural. Okay, so this is your chance for him to hear from rural programs. Like the last question, what ideas do you have to grow mentoring in your communities And so like, how could we scale this work? Is there a way that, you know, we can support this at the state level or support it nationally? We heard from Ashley, and I know that everyone said, people, we need people.
Yeah.
Anything else that you think, like, that you've been doing, it would be awesome to see this spread, you know, in more rural areas or further across the state and across the country?
Yeah, I think the message to politicians at the city, county, state, national level has to be that we are in a moment of kind of crisis right now. I mean, the Surgeon General in the last year has come out with a scathing report about youth loneliness and isolation and lack of belonging, and a scathing report about the impact of the opioid crisis on communities. Now, I noticed in rural spaces, not the number one barrier, but one of the barriers where rural youth were a lot higher were just there weren't adults around to step in. And I think there has to be a recognition that in many places, rural communities have been really devastated by opioids and other factors, right? And if the grown-ups aren't around to help, this is a pretty serious crisis. The mental health needs are shooting through the roof. And we also know from my study that we're backsliding. We seem to have hit a peak of mentoring in this country about 10 years ago with the millennials. And for a whole bunch of reasons, us adults are showing up less for them. And so I think I encourage folks to look at that full Who Mentored You study. It is full of statistics that you can use to make the case that more mentoring is needed. And I think you can use that in conversations in your own communities when you're talking to other adults to try and get them to engage with this work. But to me, I think, just pressing the fact that at any given point in time, there's probably a third to half of the kids in any community are wanting a mentor right now and don't have one. And that is the gap that we have to fill. And, I tend to think of mentoring as like one of the foundational pieces of civilization. There has never been a society that does not pass on the wisdom and resources to the next generation that has thrived. That's literally how this works. And so, I'm hopeful that those kinds of appeals can work, but that may be more hopeful than realistic, unfortunately, but one can hope.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to stop recording.